Welcome back. You're watching Front Row. We are taking a look at the education sector, the disruptions that have been witnessed owing to the pandemic. Since 15th March, learners have not been in school. We're now having a conversation about reopening. What needs to be in place? What changes in behavior and policy, as well as what do we need to ensure as far as health standards and protocols are put in place? Quickly, once again, our guests in studio, Wilson Sossion, NAT Secretary General, Dr. Githinji Gitahi, CEO, AMREF Health Africa, as well as Dr. Lucy Wakiaga, who's an education consultant as well as researcher. Mr. Sossion wanted to speak towards some of the practical things that we need to put in place currently going forward. What do we need to do, as well as concerns around and comments around the integration of ICT in our education curriculum? What are your thoughts on that before we go to questions from the audience?
Yeah, thank you. And I wish to borrow from Dr. Githinji. And at this time, more than any time before in the history of our education system, we should listen more to the doctors and to the experts. Because when we respect the experts' views, we will never go wrong and we'll do correct things. A lot of issues have been, recommendations have been put forward by Dr. Githinji that we even need the first 1 week to prepare the learners and to engage in total preparation and induction of everybody in the school learning environment on COVID-19. We have recommended that every school must have a standing committee, or rather a task force in every learning institution to deal with this matter of COVID-19. And that should draw the different stakeholders within the school. But borrowing from Dr. Githinji, a lot of things needs to be done in our schools. And we probably need, within these 3 months and immediately after the report is handed over to the minister and the COVID-19 response committee, the Ministry of Education must constitute an inspection panel that must inspect every school to ensure that the compliance measures are met by every school, or identify the gaps in literally every school. Without doing that, we can talk theoretically from the ivory towers, develop and generate very good ideas. But when you open schools, we will get into a terrible mess. We'll need a firm team to inspect every school to ensure compliance, and this must be made up of quality assurance of the Ministry of Education, personnel from the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Water, and inspect literally every school. Look at the classroom availability, the infrastructure, the sanitation, availability of water, and also ensure that the PPE, personal protective equipment, are in place, and all the protocol measures and equipment needed are in place. And every school, there must be a clear report. And in that way, it will provide a baseline data of intervention measures on each and every school over the next 3 months. By doing so, we shall know the schools that shall require more classrooms, that shall require more dormitories, that shall require water. And in that way, we shall intervene. We'll be able to generate a budget of school by school. And that we should, that if that is done, then we will be doing the right things. And this, we urge the Ministry of Education that this has to be done, so that we analyze every school and we're able to get to know the right and correct intervention measures. And that will lead to the aspect of the budget. Government may not provide all resources, but resources can be mobilized in other ways. And we prepare schools. Because one of the items in the checklist of UNESCO is that the schools must be safe to teachers and learners. It cannot be safe if we don't do a thorough inspection check. And then we'll have the 3 months to prepare both infrastructure and train the teachers. The teachers must be trained within these 3 months so that they drive very good intervention measures within the school. And then we are talking of IT. Of course, we've been caught and prepared globally. And many nations have been grappling with the aspect of using technology to drive teaching. But it has been seen that technology during this pandemic is the biggest inequalizer. That actually, when you talk of third world countries, many households, Dr. Githinji has talked about, even once we resume, there should be a stimulus package to soften the poor households. And if we talk about the households that cannot access IT infrastructures, about 90%. And even those who access, there are damages and effects. We've seen Singapore. Singapore tried using Zoom technology to conduct teaching, but all of a sudden they've banned it completely and they've stopped any attempt of virtual teaching because
you're not
cyberbullying.
For the integration of ICT.
That one, moving forward into the future, we have to rethink differently how even to use IT. There are several other issues that we have to look at in terms of gender issues. We cannot talk of resuming without addressing gender challenges, because we must resume schools in September and beyond, while focusing not only generally on learners, but we must look at the gender aspects and ensure that the girls are back in schools, learners with disabilities. There is a lot to be done. That will need to be done within the next 3 months.
We don't have too much time, so I'd quickly want us to take a look at questions and comments and have our panelists just try and respond to them as we head towards the end of the program tonight. There's a question here from... Yes, Pius Kiprono Cheruiyot asks, suppose candidates resume learning as early as or before September with strict adherence to MOH guidelines. Won't it work? Would have any of you responding to that particular comment? Nanjala says, I don't think the recommendations are putting into considerations the hardship areas where there is insufficient infrastructure and no sufficient flow of water. What does the panel think? Nashon J. Adero here speaks to racing to where with exams if health would be an obvious casualty en masse. What comes first? Again, the age profile disadvantages the experienced teachers, making them more vulnerable. More so as you move from primary to university level. We'd have Dr. Githinji speak on the age of those vulnerable and how we should go about it, even as we have this conversation on reopening of schools. Richard Omwanga says, Dr. Wakiaga has put it very well. What is the essence of education? Let's be reflective. Good comment there. Pius Kiprono once again says, ask Honorable Sosion, suppose we start partial opening of schools only for candidates both in primary and secondary schools with strict adherence to MOH guidelines, and the rest of the learners resume to September or later. I think this is a replica of what he asked before. Another one here for Dr. Githinji. Attitude problems are the single most intractable challenges we face in this COVID-19 war. How effectively are behavior change agents being involved in the combat strategy? It's a war that can't be defeated with hard science alone. Dr. Githinji will speak on behavior change agents and how we can integrate them to this conversation. There's also another question for you, Mr. Sosion. Ask Sosion what suggestions does he have as NAT Secretary General that will help cushion BOM and private teachers from economic fallout. Let's quickly, I hope our panelists have put down what are some of the things they need to respond to as we quickly look at Slido so that we can have you respond to a number of questions at the same time. Let's take a look at Slido. Cloud Nebulae TKE, I hope I've said this right. By using ICT, this means each and every student needs to be connected and devices available for all regardless of location. Well, not quite a question. Anonymous, hello. I would like to ask Honorable Sosion, what is the education sector considering in terms of helping those servicing HELB loans amidst this pandemic? And then Gina says, a question to the panel, what would be the effect of stopping co-curricular activities in schools? I'd really also like Dr. Wakiaga to respond to that on the co-curricular co-curricular activities because it is part of what is in the report by NAT, KMPDU and UASU, temporarily stopping co-curricular activities because it is not a priority currently. So you perhaps would both speak on this particular issue. I think we'd start with you, Dr. Githinji. The question on attitudes and the vulnerable. How do we handle vulnerable teachers? And I believe, Mr. Sossion, this is something you'd mention as we go forward. Let's start with you, Dr. Githinji.
Thank you. I think the first thing I would like to comment on is, there is one of the viewers asked the question around the value of education, and I think Wakiaga also commented on this. I want to comment on that and say both education and health are critical pillars to building human capital. And that is measured across the world. For you to have good human capital, you need health and education. And remember, the two are also intertwined, that when you say health and education, only healthy children learn and healthy adults earn. So the two are intertwined, that you need children to be healthy to learn. So safety of children as we reopen is the critical and priority question. If we cannot sustain and ensure safety, then there's no need of learning, because when they get sick or their parents get sick, then they can't learn. So first, I would focus on safety and then move on to learning. Now, the next thing is about attitude and behavior. People own what they understand. And I think what I've said before, and I'll say this again, is this response, the reopening of schools and any action we take must first be community-owned and then government-led. So if we start with government leadership without community ownership, then we are going to stutter. We are going to have resistant parents. We are going to have even resistant teachers, because remember, there are mates that are there in the community. You're telling a teacher, go back to work. If they are not prepared, and you have not actually prepared them to own the return to school, this is why I talked about engagement of stakeholders before return. You may have resistant teachers, and you don't want, obviously, to have police forcing teachers to go to class. So again, we must lead ownership. So that attitude and behavior will be changed by driving community ownership with government leadership. The final question I want to comment on is vulnerability. I would, highly advise that teachers who are above the high-risk age of 60, we've seen, if I was to give you an example, out of all, the total mortality, because in COVID management, you have two things. Three actually. One is preventing transmission. That's flattening the curve. Ensure as few as possible people are infected at any one time over time. Secondly, preventing death. Preventing death means that you prepare your health system capacity to ensure everyone can be catered when they need to make sure you have equitable financing that also need the care, can afford without having to sell their cows and chicken. And that's what we talk about UHC being very central to the COVID response. And finally, preventing death also means identifying and shielding the vulnerable. And we know who they are. We know that almost 40-something% of all deaths that we have had in Kenya are above 50 years. And the above 60 are the most vulnerable. So by now we should have a register on the Ministry of Education saying, out of all schools, these are the teachers who are above 60, these are male, these are female, these are the ones who have hypertension or diabetes. And then we start to ask, how do we give these teachers who are vulnerable or high risk, or even workers, not only teachers, how do we give them duties they can do at home without having to come to school and increase vulnerability? Because infections will spread. But the most critical element is to avoid mortality, to avoid severity of disease by shielding the vulnerable. That's what I would say is really critical before we reopen schools.
All right. Dr. Wakiaga, a question on stopping co-curricular activities. It is one of the recommendations in our report. And as you do that and giving us your closing remarks, where do we go as far as disaster preparedness in schools for such eventualities are concerned? Dr. Wakiaga.
Okay, thank you, Akisa. So definitely I cannot agree with getting rid of co-curricular. When we were growing up, there used to be this saying, I don't hear much of it nowadays, but we used to say all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. So it means that there has to be a holistic development of the learner. So it is not about just going to the class and trying to cover the syllabus. But the school environment is a social environment where the student develops holistically. So co-curricular is very important, especially in terms of providing those opportunities for students to be creative, for them to release that extra energy after they have come from the classroom. So definitely co-curricular has to be a part and parcel of learning. So even when schools do reopen, and as we've said earlier on, we need to move away from this rush of wanting to cover the syllabus, but really think about what are the essential topics or essential areas or essential content that our learners need to learn, and then make the school environment back to as normal as possible.
Great.
And that goes back also to the essence of CBC. So definitely co-curricular still has to be part and parcel. And especially now when students will eventually go back and they are facing trauma at this particular time.
That's
so
true.
How do they adjust back in the school environment when they go back and you tell them no co-curricular activities? So that has to be part and parcel. Co-curricular has to be part and parcel. The other thing that I really want to touch on very quickly is when we talk about providing infrastructure for the schools, I would really be a bit cautious in terms of capital investment in the schools, because just going back and we see what happened with the universities and expanding and building more campuses, and eventually the numbers of the students shrunk, and now you have all these campuses in different towns that have to be closed down. So when we think about expanding buildings, actual permanent buildings within schools, can we then think again? Are there better ways to be able to expend the resources?
Thank you.
And then in terms, the final thing you asked me was about, okay, all right.
We are very, very short on time. I'd like Mr. Session to respond to a number of questions. My apologies for that. A lot of questions posed to you, Mr. Session. Try and answer them in as little time as possible.
A number of questions have been raised. One stoppage of curriculum, we have said temporarily, because all co-curriculum are group activities, and we are talking of maintaining social distance. This is a temporary measure, and we have been very specific. Group activities like choirs and other activities. This is just a temporary measure to enforce social distance. About help loans, it doesn't come in within this context of COVID, so I may not answer that one. The cushioning of BOM and private school teachers, this is very clear within the UNESCO ILO recommendations to government that the wages of and earnings of teachers remain protected. So any school that recruited a BOM teacher, recruited with the intention of maintaining on salaries the whole year. The same case with private schools. So that has been guided internationally, and therefore no private school nor any school contravene this provision. Then the other bit is the age profile of old teachers. I can't agree more. There is need now for Teacher Service Commission to do its own analysis and do the health profile, conduct the health profile of teachers. And we know, and I wish to state that majority of the teachers in this country are 45 years and above. So in essence, we have a teaching population that may not be able to conduct duties in an environment of extreme pandemic. Finally, whether candidates can resume teaching and learning prior to September. Candidates are human beings, whether they're in Form 4, Class 8, and they're prone to disease. So as guided by the health experts, resumption can only occur when the curve is flattened.
Thank you, Mr. Sossion. Thank you very much for your thoughts and participating in this conversation tonight. Dr. Lucy Wakiaga, a consultant, education consultant and researcher, as well as Dr.